James never had model parents, like so many other children. His were deadbeats, and he'd been an accident created during a night of drug-induced passionate frenzy. His parents had never viewed him as anything other than that. Which is why, in the summer after the world ended, after the dinosaurs decided to go full zombie apocalypse and come back from the dead, they upped roots and left him behind to die. The 10-year-old had been forced to watch from the boat dock in what had once been a campground, as his parents took their pontoon boat and sailed to the other side of the lake, leaving him. And he couldn't just hike around the lake to find them, because Lake Monroe, located in the southern half of Indiana, was too big for a young kid to hike around alone, having nearly 11,000 acres of open water, and with dinosaurs running around, the hike would be impossible to complete. Even before the apocalypse, hiking around Lake Monroe would have been close to undoable. Whatever chance there had been, though, had been permanently squashed. James returned to the boat dock every day, hoping his mom and dad would be back for him. He didn't miss them, but he also didn't want to become lunch for some hungry dinosaur, or become the victim to some angry herbivorous creature that saw him as a threat. He'd take his parents' company over the alternative. So, he sat on the boat dock, where hopefully most predators couldn't get to him, day after day. The dock was made of concrete, metal, and a few other materials, and was located within the old state recreation area, right by the beach, camp store, and main campground at Paintown. It looked haphazard, and sounded as such when you walked on it, but it was solid and stable. A handful of boats, some half sunk, most either houseboats or speedboats, were still tied to it, their owners likely never to return. James slept inside one of the larger houseboats that was still afloat, after venturing aboard and finding that the bed inside was extremely comfortable. If James had known how to drive a boat, he would have followed his parents to the other side of the lake, which certainly wasn't any safer, but at least he wouldn't have been alone, and tried to be useful to them just to survive. Taking their abuses would certainly have been better than what some hungry carnivore would do to him, at least in his mind. He never thought that he'd actually want to go back to them. He would bet that kids who had literally been raised by wolves had parents with more humanity than he did. But for once, James wished that he was still with them instead of waiting for some bad end to find him. He knew that was likely what would happen, likely by the teeth of a predator, despite his waiting and hoping for something better. Deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time. As his daily routine had carried on, he saw many examples of prehistoric life. In any other situation, it would have made kids lose their mind with excitement. But James just now found them scary. Many of them were the type of carnivore that would likely eventually catch him. He saw a Tyrannosaurus rex just walking around once, uninterested in him, and another time he saw a Dimetrodon sunning itself on the boat ramp. The wildlife seemed abundant and diverse in the region. It was rare to see in the same species 2 days in a row, with many animals adapting well to the offered habitat. Another time, James watched a pack of Pyroraptors scavenging along the edge of the water at one of the beaches. Despite their name's implications, they were more fish thieves than fire thieves. Once there had been a herd of Triceratops that came down to the water's edge for a drink. Not carnivorous, but possibly just as dangerous in their own way, and just as likely to end him as a Tyrannosaur might be. There was also a single Compsognathus that had nested in an old payphone stand near the main boat dock that hadn't had a phone in it for decades, the only individual James saw regularly. It was the only local dinosaur that didn't pose a threat to James. It just squawked at him almost daily. However, on the day he was eventually caught, James hadn't seen anything that would have hinted extinct species again roamed the planet. The area had been devoid of animals all morning, so he sat at the end of the boat dock again, not letting his feet dangle in the water in case some large prehistoric fish or other aquatic predator was around, and took in the unexpected serene morning. He found that it was a shame not being able to even dangle his feet in the water. Before the apocalypse, swimming in Lake Monroe had been his favorite way to pass the day. And exploring. That was something he greatly enjoyed. Once he'd followed a large rusty pipe that came out of the water and snaked off into the woods. But it didn't go anywhere exciting, but to a young kid it felt like a great adventure and a wonderful mystery. And while on that adventure, he'd found a rock on the beach that looked vaguely like the shape of the state of Texas. A worthless find, but to a kid it was exciting and a great memory maker. Since the park was close enough to his parents' house, he was able to often find his way there to escape them for the day and actually enjoy himself. The tranquil morning was cool and clear, but if the summer weather so far had been an indicator, it would soon become hot and humid. James was absent-mindedly staring as far across the lake as he could when he heard claws tapping on the dock. Something walked up behind him. He realized he'd forgotten to check the shore behind him for threats for an extended amount of time. If he ever saw any, he would go inside the shack on the dock where the records of who owned what boat were kept, and where the owners could check in and be ferried out to their boats. As that dawned on him, James felt two hands with four claw adorned digits seize him, lift him up off the ground. It turned James to face towards itself, pale. It was a velociraptor, massively oversized, but the shape was unmistakable. It snarled and looked its catch over. The snarls then slowly seemed to turn to satisfying chuckles. The thing truly was way larger than any velociraptor had a right to be, more like the size of a Utah raptor, which meant it had to be one of the rare talking ones James had heard rumors of before the collapse. Talking ones were supposedly always larger than the non-talking counterparts, smarter too, and they always looked somewhat different too. Talking Spinosaurus had no eel-like tail, for example, and apparently, tiny feathered velociraptors were given a massive upgrade in size to be on par with the bigger dromaeosaur species. In addition, beyond simply being massively oversized, this velociraptor had no feathers at all, another major difference between it and the non-talking raptor of its species. James had heard that feathered talking dinosaurs did exist, but they seemed to be even rarer than the already rare talking ones. Who knew what the explanation for that was? It just made the event which brought the dinosaurs back even stranger. The talking ones supposedly could be reasoned with. They were perhaps as smart as humans, but also still dinosaurs. And as such, the carnivores saw nothing wrong with turning something as smarter than them into prey if they were caught. Those instincts were not pushed aside, but still very much a part of them. That was just how life worked its cycle. Because of that, they were easily more dangerous than other dinosaurs, even other carnivorous ones. The raptor tightened its grip on James's arms and began to carry him off the dock, away from the shore, obviously not in the mood to be reasoned with. As the velociraptor carried its prize, it began letting out chittering, squawking barks that echoed across the lake, turning its head with bird-like jerks, no doubt alerting its packmates that lunch was about to be served. The dinosaur was holding James in a way that both restrained him and didn't slow its quick strides, with James's legs dangling so they brushed along the ground, and so that his upper half was tucked against its belly. James certainly wasn't comfortable with that, given the fact that torn up, bite-sized bits of his body would certainly soon be stewing away inside that very spot. Each time the boy struggled, the raptor tightened its grip and its claws pressed harder against James's skin. The boy still tried to squirm free. The raptor came to a swampy bay where no boats were anchored, and then snuck up through the trees. James eventually gave his struggling up, clearly unable to escape the dinosaur. Even if he got loose, he knew he wouldn't get far. So he just let it carry him to wherever, in resignation of the inevitable. When the dinosaur finally arrived at one of the old campsites, it dropped him. And James just curled up on the ground, like he would do when his parents were angry with him. His eyes squeezed shut as he heard more footsteps closing in, on all sides. Good find, a voice said once the footsteps drew near. This one's awful small, said another, chattering deeply, and James felt warm breath on his face. Then a snout nudged his hand aside, and then a tongue slid across the side of his head. Ooh, this human is tasty, though, he added. James whimpered and curled into a tighter, protective ball as the pack of raptors began discussing how they should eat him. Those predatory instincts truly were still present in the talking ones, it seemed, as they had no qualms about what they planned to do next. I want one of the legs, said another new voice, a male one that was completely matter of fact as it spoke. The muscles are always tender there, it added. James had never felt more terrified in his life, and the only thing he could do was wait for one of them to take the first bite and hope that they'd be decent enough to kill him outright instead of eating him while he was still alive, as he'd heard other non-talking dromaeosaurs tended to do. Listening them debate on how they were going to eat him was the worst thing he'd ever been forced to endure, easily topping the abuses he'd taken from his parents over the years of what would end up being his short life. He's just a child, a new voice then said. Unexpected, quiet, without confidence, among the voices of its eager peers. It sounded feminine, and it was the first non-male voice James had heard. His tone was one of protest and not eager anticipation like the others. So what? He's easy prey, the second voice James had heard said dismissively, sounding like it was bored of waiting for its packmates to decide what parts they wanted. But he's just a boy, a child, the female voice said again. I don't want to hurt him. Enough, said a new voice, another female. As the alpha, I will say what we do with him. Her voice had a tone that demanded respect, likely why she was the alpha of the pack. Even from the short statement, James could hear the authority she held among the other raptors. The other raptors quieted down as their alpha strolled into their midst, having hung back to watch the situation play out. James heard her footsteps approaching him steadily, with purpose in their stride. They stopped next to him, and a clawed foot pushed him onto his back, out of his protective ball, then stepped down on his chest. He still didn't open his eyes, even as he felt its killing sickle claw prick him right over his heart. He even squeezed his eyes shut tighter, not wanting to even see a glimpse of the dinosaurs that surrounded him. If I stabbed him here, he'd be dead in a minute, the alpha said, possibly inviting comment from the raptor who had rebuked the opinion of the rest. It wouldn't be the first human. Red, please, said the only other female James had heard. Tell me, Diamond, why do you think we shouldn't eat this human here? You've never protested before. Or any creature, Red asked. If I struck him with my claw now, it would be quick. Just like the others, he wouldn't suffer for more than a few seconds. He was caught by our fellow here fairly. You know as well as the rest of us that is simply the way the cycle of the world works. Diamond didn't answer for a moment, then said, I don't know. My instincts outside of the ones my carnivorous side are saying, maybe. I just feel like we shouldn't. Maybe because he's just a youngster. Maybe it's the part of me still in grief speaking up. Part of me that wanted to be a mother but didn't get to. The part who had to watch her future children. Diamond trailed off. Then her voice returned with an increase in confidence. I don't like the idea of any more children not getting to live their lives. Like mine. And he's young. That means he has a mother somewhere. I can't put her through the pain I felt. No one with a child should ever feel that loss. Even if he was caught as prey fairly this time, I have to protest. Red stared at the other raptor now, with a softened gaze. She understood the tragedy her packmate was referring to. It had been a time that had really affected Diamond, losing her first and only ever clutch of eggs, and it had left some mental trauma, even though she'd mostly recovered with the support of her pack behind her with companionship. But that void left by the trauma had never refilled completely, and this event had clearly dredged some of those memories back up from that void. Red sighed and took her foot off James. Okay, she said, concern and understanding as she spoke, not looking at James, but at her packmate. I'll spare him, but his fate is now your responsibility, and yours alone. Whatever happens to him, if he runs away or is caught by something else, it is on you and not the pack. Understand? I understand, Diamond nodded. Thank you, she said. Red nodded, giving Diamond a slight smile. James, meanwhile, had now dared to crack his eyes open ever so slightly. He saw 5 oversized, featherless velociraptors standing around him. Diamond was covered in bluish-green scales everywhere, except for her belly and the inner sides of her legs, and the underside of her tail, which were all light gray in color. Most of her body also had an ever so slight purplish tinge to it as well, but it was never the dominant color at any point. The rest of the pack dispersed, one particular individual grumbling harshly until Red silenced them with a warning hiss. But Diamond remained and slowly approached James once they were gone. James was still shaking and clearly terrified, even as he opened his eyes fully to gaze at the raptor that had saved him from being ripped to pieces and eaten by the other members of its pack. Thank you, he managed to quietly say, voice trembling ever so slightly. Diamond smiled at him, lowering herself down and crawling up next to him on all fours, in an effort to be more at eye level and appear less threatening. She hoped it came off as such, but she wasn't sure. Nor was she sure how to truly approach the situation she was now in by her own volition. After examining James for a moment, she jumped back onto her hind legs and picked him up like the other raptor had done, but she did so in a much gentler manner and didn't forcefully tuck him against herself. Rather, she held James against her chest, purring softly, and he couldn't help but lean against her in response to her clear attempt to calm him down after his terrifying experience. He found himself surprised at how quickly he went from being terrified of the dinosaurs to now leaning into one for comfort. Like a switch was flipped. Where's your family? Diamond asked. If he knew, then she'd take him back there. After all, she wouldn't want another mother to experience what she had before. Taking their son back would help keep that from happening. I don't have one, James quietly replied. Diamond continued purring, suddenly sounding pleased. No, the sound was rather more suddenly hopeful, even daring excitement about something. However, the sudden change in tone vanished as quickly as it appeared, as Diamond internally talked herself down and told herself not to get ahead of herself. At best, this would only be a temporary charge in her care. Well, you do now, at least until we find people for you. The others will come around, I promise, she assured, feeling excited at James's response despite telling herself not to. Maybe there would be no people for him to go to. Could she finally fill that void? After a second, she steadied herself, again thinking that she was making too many promises and entertaining too many hopes too quickly. There was 100 things that might keep this child from staying. She had to remind herself about that, despite her eagerness. Come on, she gently said, with part of her still hoping that she might have another chance at being a mother. If her human charge was okay with the idea, and there was indeed nothing that took him from their territory. That was by far the most likely probability in her eyes, so she was braced for it just in case it did come to pass. Still carrying him in a gentle manner, she took James back to her nest, which was in one of the other nearby campsites. The campsite itself was small, primitive, with just within view of the lake, and the nest within wasn't far from an old fire ring that sat in the campsite. Diamond set James down inside the nest before laying down next to him in a protective manner, instinctively snuggling close to him in a shielding way, like a mother bird would do with her freshly hatched chicks. Her nest wasn't large, it was basically a small hole dug into the ground with some leaves and sticks forming an outer raised border, so she had to lay close along his side and snuggle around his form, but James didn't really mind being basically trapped in the spot. He found that he trusted the raptor after what she had done and how she had treated him. Diamond gently stroked his hair with one of the claws growing from her fingers, trying to make him feel comfortable. James couldn't deny to himself that he thought it felt nice. It was a feeling that he had never experienced, and he realized that Diamond, a dinosaur, had already shown him more care than his mom or dad ever had. And that was just in the span of a few minutes, too. What did that truly say about the kind of people his mom and dad were? Diamond, meanwhile, just hoped she wasn't being overbearing at all, even though she wanted to fill the void she had inside. She didn't want him to feel like it was too much sudden affection. She wanted nothing more in her life than to have a chance to be what was taken from her the moment her eggs had been crushed, even though part of her kept saying it wouldn't happen here. She was a soul as lonely as her sudden charge was. But if there was someone of his own kind the boy could go to, then she knew she'd have to take him there despite her own feelings. He said he didn't have one, but what if there was a chance that that might have been the case? That came to pass. That indeed he did have people he could go to, then so be it. However, for the moment, Diamond could enjoy having at least a feeling of what being a parent to something was like. The worry of being overbearing came hurtling back, though. Her private concerns of showing too much affection were alleviated, though, when James gently began to stroke Diamond on the top of her head. She purred softly, a chittering sound emerging from deep in her throat, and her whole body relaxed. James sat up and began to hug her, not wanting to let the one thing that had not only saved his life, but ever seemed to care for him go. Diamond continued to chitter softly and just let him hug her for as long as he wanted, wanting to give her unexpected charge all the love she could now that she had something to care for. Maybe the moment would not be fleeting after all. The weeks went on, and summer was slowly passing. By the signs, it had turned to late July. Diamond had long since showed James the now abandoned camp store, which he had never thought to look inside of before. The door had been left unlocked, and when checking inside, James found that there was not only camping supplies inside, but plenty of food to last for months, though the ice cream was all long melted. The shelves were still stocked with canned, dried, or bagged food, large packages of bottled water, simple first aid kits, and basic survival gear. It seemed that no looters had ever thought to raid a tiny camp store. There were also fishing rods, equipment to clean fish with, bait items, chopped firewood, lighters, informative pamphlets on wildlife and plant species, cheap odds and ends that might have use at some point, and even a tent and sleeping bag were still in the store. In addition, there were also bottled sodas still in the cooler, a whole lot of them. Their discovery had been a pleasant surprise, and while they were warm, they made a tasty treat nonetheless. Diamond didn't find the carbonated drinks to be anything special when she tried one, but she found the stuff in the store to be interesting and took her time peering at the rows of shelves, her claws ticking on the concrete floor as she walked down each aisle. James knew the winter was going to be hard, so getting an early start on preparing was key. The houseboat he'd spent weeks sleeping in had no power, and he wasn't sure how to change that. But he had experience at keeping warm during the winter without heat. His parents' house rarely ever had heat during the cold months. They were always more focused on cooking methamphetamines and being high on it than having heat in the house. They spent their drug money on all sorts of things other than a furnace to warm the decaying shack they called the house, which was hardly even insulated. So James had spent his childhood learning how to survive the winter. James also knew that the dozens of other still anchored houseboats on the lake likely had supplies on them as well, some of which would be very useful for keeping warm, such as sweatshirts and blankets. Nothing else, he could at the least make a giant bundle of them for himself. In addition, he had also been properly introduced to the pack, but this time as one of them and not as their next meal. The individuals other than Diamond were Red, the alpha of the pack, Ghost, Path, and True Eyes. Ghost was paler white in color, with gray stripes and silver speckles on the back of his head, as well as wild-looking white claws on his hands and feet. He had been the one who caught James, and he had apologized for wanting to eat him several times. Ghost was an eager individual who loved the thrill of hunting and chasing down prey, be that prey a small fish or something much larger with legs that could run. He'd once, living up to his name in the process, showed James just how easily he could disappear in a forest environment. It was so quick that it was frightening. Pat was more of a solid dark gray color, with some blue splotches, a softer individual in terms of personality, but still a relentless hunter. Red was mostly gray, except for the red-orange dorsal coloring on her back, which folded over the top of her head like a hood almost. Red was a smart leader and fiercely defended her pack when needed, caring deeply about each individual. And True Eyes was about as dull in personality as his own gray coloring was. He was the only one in the pack to not apologize to James for what they had been about to do to him. He looked like he still wanted to snack on the newest packmate, but he wouldn't risk actually trying it. When she'd apologized to him, Pat had also explained to James that one reason for their initial coldness towards him, in contrast to the friendliness he now enjoyed, was the fact that in the moment he'd been viewed as they viewed any other potential creature they caught, as prey, and thus they'd been impartial towards his feelings on what would happen. It did take time, but James came to accept this and soon came to trust them, except for True Eyes. James wisely kept his distance from him. Ghost and Path also began to take turns watching James so Diamond could find herself something to eat. They both had come to like him greatly, almost seeing him as a little brother. Red also liked him well enough, but didn't take a turn at watching him. Being the alpha of the pack, she didn't do jobs like that. Diamond, meanwhile, proved herself to be a very loving character. Despite her dangerous claws and teeth, she was far gentler and more kind to James than his own mother had ever been. Diamond clearly was enjoying her motherly role as well, with a sparkle steadily growing in her eyes and confidence slowly replacing the fragile state she'd met James in, going above and beyond for anything her unofficially adopted child needed. And as the weeks, then months, went on, the idea of something coming and taking James away became an ever more distant thought in her mind. With that, the void within her was also all but filled again. James had gotten the privilege of watching the pack hunt on several times. He found them when he wasn't the target of the hunt. Seeing them work and sneak up on prey that had no clue the raptors were around was exhilarating. The campground they had set up their territory in was large and open, with few trees in the area around the camp store, the beach, and boat docks. It was a good area and attracted many animals. One day, a lone subadult steppe mammoth had wandered out from the forest area of the campground, and the oversized velociraptors took notice. From the camp store, James had got to watch the 5 dinosaurs creep close, slowly on all sides, as the unaware mammoth strolled through the campground, heading towards the lake. when suddenly Diamond and Red had leapt in from either side and latched onto the mammoth's side, tearing into its leg muscles. It bellowed and stamped, but couldn't shake the raptors off as two more, Ghost and True Eyes, leapt up from in front of it as it was mid-stamp and latched onto its neck. The mammoth continued shaking its head as Path joined the chaos by leaping onto the mammoth's head. After a few further minutes of vicious slashing claws, the mammoth collapsed, and the raptors finished it off. All 6 members of the pack ate very well that night. Once cooked, James thought the meat tasted somewhat like tough, tender wood bison, a meat he knew well because his parents tended to enjoy buying what they saw as exotic meat with their dealing money. Whenever the raptors made a kill, James cooked the share he was provided, anything from white-tailed deer meat to fresh fish caught in the lake, in the various fire rings scattered throughout the entire campground, which had quickly begun to feel like a home to the boy. He'd never thought in the wildest fantasy the apocalypse would have been the thing that saved him from the pitiful life he'd once had with his parents. Instead of a tiny shack that was falling apart, he now had an entire campground to explore and call home. One cloudy morning, James had awoken before Diamond. He was lying on his back facing the sky, and she was snuggled up next to him, holding him with loving gentleness like she always did. James understood why Diamond liked keeping him so close. He'd been told how she'd lost her clutch of eggs, of the near debilitating trauma that followed, and he knew that she didn't want to risk it happening again. Might have been young, but James was old enough to know that there was still lingering trauma there that manifested in Diamond's constant protective hold on him. So he didn't mind it one bit. After all, she'd saved him and was giving him a chance to actually have a happy life. So however she went about doing it was okay with him. Since he still slept in her nest alongside her, he knew he couldn't move without waking her. So James stayed still and waited for his guardian to awake herself. Her hand rested on his chest, and he could feel the claws at the ends of her fingers resting against his skin, lightly pricking at him through his shirt. His curiosity towards them suddenly piqued. Though he had lived with the raptors for months by then, he'd never actually taken a proper look at their claws, one of the most standout features of the dinosaurs. Their claws, the very thing that had made Velociraptor and the members of its collective genus famous, were the one thing that he had never properly looked at. He could feel the largest claw on one of Diamond's toes laying across his leg and looked down on it. They really were wicked looking. Diamond's claws were all dark gray in color, and they looked like they'd really pack a punch. They looked like they definitely lived up to the reputation they'd been given in nearly every piece of dinosaur media. Impressive, aren't they? Diamond asked. James hadn't noticed she'd woken up, and he realized he must have disturbed her when he sat up to look at the claw that was against his leg. Morning, she added with a yawn, shaking her head and smacking her jaws lightly. Her tone sounded somewhat amused when she spoke. Did I wake you up? James asked. Sorry if I did. No, you didn't, Diamond replied. I've only been lightly dozing since the sun came up. If you want to look at them, you can. It's natural to be curious, and it's not like they're a secret. James nodded after a moment, finding himself truly very curious for a look. He took her hand and ran his thumb over the claws. I noticed that in the movies I used to watch secretly in the middle of the night, that they'd always focus on those ones when a raptor showed up, he said, when his gaze drifted down to the large sickles on each middle toe. But actually seeing them, they're really cool. I used to have a Velociraptor plushie toy. I always liked the big ones on the inner toes. They looked like they could protect, well, me. Only my plushie had been the real thing. He stopped talking for several seconds, until he realized that he was staring and he shook himself. Sorry, I didn't mean to stare, he murmured. Diamond was right. He couldn't help being curious. Getting to see the deadly parts of a killer dinosaur up close without risk was a rare opportunity, but touching them really did make him feel small and it had drug up some hard memories as well. He was even more grateful now that he was getting a good look at them, that they had not been used on him. Diamond chuckled. I don't think the deer I sunk them into yesterday would agree that they're so cool, she said, standing up and stretching. Are you hungry? She asked, wanting to get off the topic of her precious human's painful past. Yeah, I could eat, James replied, looking grateful that Diamond hadn't pressed the issue. I just need to build a fire first, he added, hoping the embers from the one the night before would still be warm enough to make the job easy. Diamond nodded. I can catch you something while you do that. What would you like? Fish, turtle, squirrel, duck? Diamond asked, naming off a mix of things she enjoyed. Before James could answer, he felt something land on his head. A drop of water. He looked up and felt one land in his eye. Aw, man, he groaned. A raincoat had been one of the things the camp store didn't seem to have. He'd yet to find one, and he was not overly fond of getting wet. Not to mention, now a fire to cook breakfast with definitely wasn't going to happen. Diamond looked up at the sky. She chittered softly. She didn't mind the rain, but knew James did, and that he was a little bit less tolerant of the elements than she was. You might want to go inside. Where's that boat you said you were sleeping in? On the furthest dock from here, James replied, looking a little miserable at having to go all the way there. Diamond paused. Then she chittered again. I have an idea. Come down with me to the dock where Ghost found you. It's much closer. After arriving, the rain still light, but becoming heavier, Diamond stopped at the edge of the dock and pointed out at a specific pontoon boat. It was about 6 feet away from the dock and was sunk at the bow end, but the stern was still completely above water, at more or less an even level due to the shallow water. It had a roof over the half that wasn't sunk. Will that work? Diamond asked. Yeah, James replied. Diamond nodded and crouched, motioning him to climb onto her back. James climbed up as instructed, and with a powerful leap, Diamond jumped over the water and onto the boat, which one could stand on easily due to its even level. She landed on both feet with a heavy thud that shook the body of the wrecked boat, and James jumped off, getting under the roof with Diamond just behind as it began to rain harder. Thank you, James said, listening to the increasing patter of rain on the metal roof, as they settled down behind the boat operator's seat to wait the rain shower out. Anything for you, Diamond replied, nuzzling her human child with warmth and tenderness. James smiled and hugged her tightly, causing Diamond to purr. You seem really happy, James said. Diamond smiled at him. Believe me, I am. I always wanted to be a mother, as you know, and it almost didn't happen either. Taking you in was a golden chance for me, even though at the time I thought it might have just been for that day only. I just hope you've been happy with us. James smiled and began gently rubbing Diamond's nose as she curled around him, keeping him warm as the temperature began to drop from the weather. I have been. You're the kind of parent I always wanted. One that actually loves me, James said, still stroking her head. More like the kinds of moms some of the other kids I knew had. Ones who cared for them. And you're not even human. Diamond nudged him affectionately at the corner. Hey, Diamond? James asked. Yes, she replied. I just want you to know that, well, beyond being what I wanted for a parent, you've been the best thing I've ever had in my entire life. Is it okay if I started calling you my mom? James replied, nervous about asking. He'd been hesitant to do so, much less ask sooner. Not because he considered his birth mother his mom, though. He'd only called his biological mother Mom one time, and he'd gotten smacked for it. However, Diamond, dinosaur or not, had had already shown James more love and care than that woman ever had. It was a true testament to which one was truly more human, when the resurrected animal with killing claws that just happened to have the rare anomaly of a powerful brain very similar to a human one showed more love and humanity than the actual human did. Nonetheless, he'd been so scared about how she might react, despite the role in his life that she'd taken up, that he just couldn't make himself be brave enough to say the word until then. But as he saw her reaction, James felt instant relief, and he knew that he had just made Diamond the happiest dinosaur on the planet. "I'd love that," Diamond eagerly answered, and James smiled again. "I love you, my sweet son," Diamond said, almost not daring to say the words that she'd felt would be forever denied to her, as James laid down and rested against her side. Diamond purred as he did, holding her treasure close with her claws and not letting go. They both got what they wanted in the end. James truly had a parent, and Diamond the Velociraptor finally had a child to care for. The void was filled. James was still hugging her when Diamond lifted her head and snatched something from the water. Grinning like a dinosaur could, she held a wriggling, small-mouthed bass out. "Breakfast?" she asked through clenched teeth. James laughed. "I'll wait until the rain's over. Raw fish doesn't sound too appetizing to me." Diamond nodded, and with a few snaps of her jaws, the fish had vanished down her gullet. "Suit yourself, but I was getting hungry too." "You can eat all the fish you want. There's a whole lake full," James said. Diamond actually giggled at the comment and lightly poked her son on the nose with one of her finger claws. "With how much you eat, that might not be enough." "Hey!" James protested, but Diamond just laughed and nuzzled him again. She loved having a child more than anything else, and she showed that affection in that moment by giving James a giant, loving lick right across his face. "Mom!" James said, wiping the saliva off. He'd still been hesitant to say it for just a moment, but he shoved his fear aside, and the word had come out sounding natural. Diamond shrugged at his protest. "Just showing you I love you in my own way," she said. "And if you don't approve, you'd best hope I never have to give you a bath that way." "Don't worry, I'll wash in the lake," James assured. Diamond just chuckled quietly, tapping her large toe claws on the shag-carpeted deck of the boat in amusement. For the first time in her life, Diamond was truly happy. Herschel had survived alone since the fall of human civilization. He never joined a group and stayed away from dinosaurs and other prehistoric threats whenever possible. He spent the first 5 years of the apocalypse living in a well-stocked and very isolated warehouse located in the Atlantic Northeast. He stayed inside most of the time because the warehouse had all the things a person needed, even a kitchen, a lounge, and a bathroom. The main storage area was so well stocked on food and other crucial supplies that he could live off them for decades. However, he would occasionally go out to make sure the area was still safe, deserted, and bring back supplies of anything that his stock was short on. Once, while searching another warehouse where 2 people had died in what appeared to be a game of Russian roulette, Herschel had been attacked by an Andrewsarchus that had followed him inside. He got lucky, all things considered, because one of the revolvers on the table still had a bullet in it. The animal's fur had made a very nice jacket and hat. Herschel also added tally marks to one of the walls in his warehouse daily to keep track of the time passing, and had done so since he'd moved in. Then, after 5 years, he was forced to leave the warehouse that had become his home when it had caught on fire unexpectedly in the night. The entire building was destroyed, and he barely made it out of the one door he hadn't permanently sealed shut before the flames consumed everything. Herschel had enough foresight to escape with some basic supplies, including a rifle, which only contained 5 rounds of ammunition, he'd collected as he left the building. After that, Herschel stayed in abandoned cars and old homes at night. He traveled the roads by day and continued his practices of staying away from both people and dangerous animals. Once, while walking within sight of the Atlantic Ocean in the state of Virginia, Herschel met a very cute and friendly baby Tyrannosaurus rex. This animal could talk, one of the many mysteries the anomaly that resurrected them left behind. However, its parents were not so nice, and were very much the type of characters from which Herschel tried to steer clear. The baby was so affectionate that Herschel momentarily let his guard down and did not see the parents returning. Instead of eating Herschel, they ran him out of their territory, though the baby didn't like having his new friend chased away. That was among the closest he'd been to such large dinosaurs. Although he did have closer shaves with dangerous ones over the years. The scariest encounter had to be the time a Giganotosaurus had pinned Herschel under its foot and was tasting him with its tongue, its teeth mere inches from his face. Yet, for whatever reason, despite having Herschel dead to rights, the Giganotosaurus simply lost interest and walked away. Herschel wasted no time in making a quick exit once the dinosaur's focus was elsewhere, and afterwards never returned within 10 miles of that area again. He would often pass through the same areas several times a year. After the warehouse fire, he spent his days traveling up and down the eastern coast of the United States, simply surviving, following the same route from southern Florida to northern Maine. Sticking as close to the ocean as possible, Herschel noticed many things. Paracelophilus herds seemed to stick close to shorelines and would feast upon leaves from palm trees frequently, often accompanied by small, spiky Polacanthus. Nothosaurus, a prehistoric aquatic reptile, always stuck together and lived in pairs. Animals like Thalassorodon, Liopleurodon, Basilosaurus, Megalodon, and other prehistoric giants of the oceans could easily eat great white sharks, which, while not surprising, was very shocking and numbing to witness. Homo ergaster were able to thrive along coastlines and were excellent at tracking animal prints left in the sand by their potential meals. Coelophysis were often among the first scavengers to find whatever washed up upon the shore overnight. Various species of pterosaur, like Tapejara, had taken a great liking to nesting out on abandoned oil rigs and half-sunken ships. There was also no shortage of people who had taken to life out on the ocean. They'd become a new generation of pirates. It also turned out that conodonts were surprisingly delicious to eat, but, oddly enough, Allosaurus and others in that specific genus would avoid eating conodonts like they were poison. Herschel sometimes wondered how the baby Rex was doing. He was probably almost fully grown after all the years that had passed since they'd met. Herschel had stopped counting, but it had to be roughly a decade into the dinosaur apocalypse by then. On what began as any other day, Herschel sat on a large rock near a waterfall, thinking about the only other time he had encountered a talking dinosaur. It had been another carnivore. He didn't know the species, but it looked like a miniature T-Rex, and it had been very talkative. It showed him to a cave so he could get out of a bad rainstorm, but it had left, never to be seen again. Herschel wondered why the dinosaur helped him sometimes, but the talking ones were enigmas. Maybe they were more like people in some ways than they were dinosaurs. It seemed that they were not instinct-based killers like their non-talking counterparts often tended to appear as. He also wondered why he had never seen a talking herbivore, though they had to be out there. Maybe it was because they stuck to herds, likely with non-talking members of their own species, and since Herschel avoided all prehistoric animals if able, then that hypothesis was certainly a possible explanation. Herschel rubbed his eyes and gazed at the waterfall. He hadn't slept well the previous night. He'd spent it inside the skeleton of a dinotherium. Teeth marks were everywhere on the bones, so it must have been killed and eaten by a large carnivorous dinosaur. He laid an old blanket over the ribcage, but, despite having shelter, it was not a good night. Throughout the night, the noises of large animals surrounded him. One sound that stood out the most was the one that sounded like a giganotosaurus, which was quite worrisome. He usually slept in a structure or car, but there had been none in the area, so he'd been forced to spend the night out in the elements, wide awake for most of the time. But he survived, and his tired mind had been wandering since he sat in front of the waterfall to try to wake up. So, he didn't hear something walking up behind him as he wondered about the apparent lack of talking herbivorous dinosaurs. Nor did he hear it come to a halt once its shadow covered his back. Good morning! Herschel nearly fell off the rock, sputtered in surprise, and was startled out of his thoughts by the cheerful voice that suddenly rang out. He fell partially onto the ground, catching himself before falling off the rock completely, and spun around to see the source of the voice. It was a Baryonyx. And it was wishing him a good morning. Baryonyx was not the largest dinosaur species out there, but it was still a very dangerous one. What it lacked in size, it made up for with teeth and large claws. The one Herschel was now face to snout with was a young adult female, mostly orange in color, with a blue and golden stripe going down each side of her scaly body. What? Can you not speak? She asked him after a moment of silence. I've never met a human who couldn't speak. What do you want with me? Herschel stuttered, worried he was about to become breakfast. Well, I'd like to talk with you, or play with you, or both, the Baryonyx said as if it was the most casual request in the world. My siblings and I used to play a game called Hunt. I think it was like a game you humans call tag? Is that right? She eagerly explained. Is this actually happening now the talking Baryonyx wants to play tag with me? Herschel thought, his eyes wide with disbelief. He'd have laughed at the absurdity if it wasn't so terrifying. He shook his head. This was clearly not a normal day in a world of abnormalities. Will you play with me? The Baryonyx asked, with the mannerisms of a child. Then after we can talk and get to know each other, she eagerly added. Deciding that he could use the opportunity to slip away, Herschel slowly stood and nodded. Sure, he said, wide-eyed, trying to figure out a good way to escape. Good! Start running, cutie, the dinosaur said. Herschel didn't need to be told twice. No longer tired, he turned and sprinted away from the dinosaur as fast as he was able. Cute! That's not something a dinosaur should say. That's not something any dinosaur should say. Especially to a person, Herschel thought. The Baryonyx watched him sprinting as if his life depended on it and giggled, flexing her large finger claws as she prepared to start giving chase. When the human was out of sight, she snorted in an amused manner and began the hunt. Herschel sprinted through the forest, kicking up coastline sand from the ground as he did, being mindful not to trip on exposed roots that stuck up in various angles from the bases of the trees. Surrounding him was a mix of palm trees and others that had thick roots of varying height and thickness with peeling bark and vivid green leaves. As he was passing one of those trees, he reached out and grabbed it in order to stop himself. He skidded to a sudden halt, leaving a trench in the sand, and used his remaining momentum to swing around the tree and run in a completely different direction. He hoped that this sudden change in direction would be enough to shake the dinosaur off his trail. After a minute of running and seeing no sign of his pursuer in the surrounding trees, he thought that he'd managed to lose the Baryonyx. Suddenly, her snout swung into him from his right side and sending him flying into a pile of white sand. Herschel groaned as she stomped her clawed feet down on either side of him and said triumphantly, Got you! And now for my prize! Herschel rolled onto his back and looked up at her, wiping sand from his eyes. What prize? He asked, taking deep breaths and expecting to be eaten up like a fish. The Baryonyx leaned down closer to him, and Herschel tensed. A nice chat with you, the dinosaur replied, backing up a few steps so Herschel could sit up without hitting his head on her belly. Chat? He asked, sitting up. The Baryonyx eagerly nodded. I wanted to talk with you and get to know you, she said brightly. I've not seen a human in 5 years, so it'll be fun. That was also why I wanted to chase you. I've never actually tried to catch a human, so I wanted to see if I could. Fun chat. Wanted, Herschel sputtered. What? Did I knock the ability to talk out of you when I hit you? I didn't whack you that hard, did I? I just swung my head like I would when fishing. The dinosaur chuckled. She seemed quite friendly. Sorry, I just didn't expect this, Herschel admitted more steadily. He stood up and brushed the sand from his clothes. The Baryonyx nodded. Well, come on. We'll chat back at my nest. It's not far. Over by that waterfall you were sitting at when I found you. I was quite surprised when I came back and saw you sitting there. Herschel watched the dinosaur, hesitating on what his next action should be. After a few seconds, she stopped walking and turned to wait on him. He decided to take the chance that she was being truthful, and he began to follow her. If she wanted to kill him, then she would have when she had him pinned between her legs on the sand pile, he told himself. Hey, you have a name? Herschel asked as he followed her back through the woods. Nessie, but I prefer to go by Ness, the dinosaur replied, looking over his shoulder. You? Herschel. He introduced himself. Not short for anything, and that's what I like to go by. Ness laughed, and Herschel couldn't stop the slight grin that appeared on his face. As he spent more time with Ness, Herschel found himself liking her more and more. His sense of fear toward her quickly vanished once they started to talk back at her nest, and a connection formed between them very quickly. Ness was very nice and caring, unless you were a fish. If you were a fish, then she thought you looked delicious. Herschel noted during their talk that a lot of Ness's personalities mirrored his own before the end of the world, and it brought back some of his old pre-apocalypse sparkle back. Herschel found that he enjoyed talking with Ness so much that when she asked if they could be friends, he eagerly agreed, much to her joy. She and Herschel worked very well together, and, in Herschel's mind, his life had taken a turn for the better when she'd asked to play tag with him. They were no longer alone. They were like two souls that had finally connected after being apart for a long while. This relationship felt like it was always supposed to be. It was roughly a year later when an old problem returned to Ness's life. A talking male Baryonyx, who had tried to force Ness to mate with him multiple times, came back into her territory. Herschel, who hadn't been told about the annual encounter, had later learned that the male dinosaur returned every year just before mating season to try to get Ness to be his. This idea disgusted her. After being forced to deal with him for what seemed to be the 100th time in her life, Ness and Herschel decided to leave the area and travel into the interior of the North American continent to see what other sights they might see. It had been Ness's idea to leave and travel over the mountains to find a new place. Months later, while they were still on this cross-country journey, Herschel suggested the idea of visiting Lake Michigan, and Ness decided that she really wanted to see it after being told just how large it was. In fact, she thought it might possibly make a perfect new home due to the limitless source of fresh water. So while resting at an old rest stop in northern Alabama, they made the choice to change directions and began to head north. They didn't know it at the time, but that decision would lead to bigger changes in their lives than they could have ever imagined. Just a few months after they changed directions, they would run into someone who would open a door to new possibilities for the both of them. Jack was running. He didn't know where he was, just that he was somewhere within view of a section of the Appalachian mountain range. The forests here were dense and untamed, and those that lived on the mountains before the apocalypse could only do so because the forests didn't force them away. However, those that disappeared here did so because they disrespected it. Jack now dove and shoved his way through one of those forests, having left his camp well behind after being chased away from it by the thing that was causing him to run for his life. He wasn't running from a bear, or a deranged hermit, or some feral human living in the mountains. He was running from a dinosaur, one that had decided it wanted to make him its afternoon meal. At one time in his life, that would have been an impossible scenario to experience, but it was reality for all those still alive. He hadn't gotten a good look at it in his hurry to escape from it, but he thought that it looked like a Dilophosaurus from the size and the crests on its head. While that, ironically, might have been his favorite species as a kid, he was not interested in becoming a meal for one. He had bigger aspirations for life than just becoming another unremembered meal for some hungry dinosaur, or any carnivore in general. He knew that his only hope was to outrun it, because since it had been over 10 years since the world ended, he knew he wouldn't, or would be extremely unlikely to at any rate, find a car that worked he could escape in. What he needed to find was a place to hide, an abandoned cabin. There were hundreds dotted around the mountains, or a small cave that he could squeeze into where the dinosaur could not follow. Anywhere that could keep him from being the next person to go missing in the mountains. Jack dodged between several tree trunks until he did the worst thing he could have in that moment. He tripped on a root. With a yelp, he tumbled into the root's tree. The trunk felt oddly soft, he noticed, and then onto the ground next to it. Groaning, he rolled onto his back and saw what he'd run into. It took a moment to register that what he thought was a root was actually the end of a clawed toe. One of 3 clawed toes that were attached to a large foot. A slow glance to his left showed that he was lying next to a large ankle, and glancing up further, still partially refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him, he saw what he had fallen against, what he'd thought was just another tree trunk, was actually a leg, virtually the same color as an actual tree trunk, which was attached to an unusually large Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was looking down at him, eyes piercing his own, large upper teeth partially exposed and glinting. Its head cocked to the side slightly, and it was growling softly. The Tyrannosaurus then let out a deep, low, vibrating vocalization as it looked down at him, making an ominously inquisitive sound without even opening its jaws. Somehow, perhaps because Jack felt the vibrations as the sound passed through him, it was more terrifying than a loud roar would have been. Jack just stared up at it, frozen from surprise. How did I not see that? He pondered, in a brief moment of calm, before the weight of the true horror at what the sight meant set in. He didn't know how he'd had such tunnel vision that he saw what should have obviously been there, and obviously another threat, as just another tree. Now he was going to be eaten by this dinosaur instead of the other one that had been chasing him. Not even bothering to get up, he laid his head back in the dirt in resignation to his fate and waited to be scooped up and pierced by the mighty, jagged teeth in the Tyrannosaur's jaws. Well, my. What are you doing? The words triggered some reaction in his brain, and it finally fired off a command of movement. Jack shot up from his lying position and scooted back from the massive dinosaur. He'd heard from other survivors over the years that some of them could talk, but he'd never actually seen one. All he was able to sputter out was a, "What the f—" The Tyrannosaur snorted, tracing her large teeth with her tongue. She was a mix of various shades of brown, hence why she blended in with the forest so well. Her scaly, featherless skin appeared rough and tough-looking, and it was warty in places. Her eyes were green, with black pupils narrowed in focus. A dark ring of colored scales surrounded her eyes as well, making the green appear even brighter and more vivid. Her upper back, upper tail, and top of her head were a dark brown color, as was her legs. Her belly, underjaw, and the bottom of her tail were a more light tan, and in between the two colors there was an area that was more of a mix between the two, and it was like a barrier between them. She also had stripes of an even darker shade of brown covering her snout, down her neck, and down her back to the end of her tail. She stood tall, maybe close to 10 feet taller or a little less than a non-speaking Rex would stand. She also stood more upright and straighter than the forward-leaning non-talking ones would. Yet, of all her appearance, what Jack took notice of most was her sheer size. A normal Tyrannosaurus would at least have to bite a human in half in order to eat it. This one looked big enough to just swallow one whole. Before either Jack or the Rex could say anything else, there was a shriek from the Dilophosaurus chasing him as it scampered to a stop a few paces from the Rex. The Tyrannosaur looked at it, and then back at Jack. "Oh, running from something trying to eat you, are you?" "I can help with that." Her voice was not very deep, and surprisingly rather gentle sounding, but as she spoke, and looked down at Jack and stopped licking her lips, her aura suddenly turned more sinister. To Jack it became clear what she meant by help. He wasn't going to be the one helped. He sputtered and tried to scramble to his feet, but the Rex was faster. She knocked him back down with her nose, and then grabbed him by his legs in her jaws. Not hard enough to break the skin, but just enough to hold him firmly. She then lifted her head away from the ground, carrying Jack upwards away from the angry Dilophosaurus, and then tossed him skyward, opening her jaws wide below him. The last thing Jack saw as he tumbled down was the open abyss of teeth racing up to meet him. The long tongue and gaping throat, and the vivid green eyes wide open and alight with excitement. He landed inside the jaws, struck the fleshy interior with force, and they slammed shut around him, and everything in his world turned black. When Jack eventually came to and opened his eyes, it took a moment to process what had happened. When it did all come back to him, he jerked, practically spasmed, into an upright position right away, panting hard from panic, expecting to see a hungry Tyrannosaur standing nearby, ready to eat him for real this time. Though he didn't see her immediately, he still felt that this was it. Despite everything he'd done to get this far, he was just going to end up being another person who simply couldn't make it. He'd been lying on his back on the forest floor, staring up at the trees, sticky from the dried dinosaur saliva, and everywhere was sore from the impact of his landing. He felt a strong dizziness from the sudden movement and groaned, trying to clear his pounding head. "Welcome back to the world of the living," a familiar voice said, breaking through the fog in his head. Jack stumbled up and onto his feet, then spun around and saw the Rex lying on her stomach right behind where he'd been lying, looking rather amused and even concerned. Her eyes and pupils were now much more relaxed than they'd been when Jack had literally run into her, and when he'd been falling into her mouth after being tossed in the air like a toy. He didn't buy the look of concern, though. Even though she was a dinosaur, it was still plain on her face to see, and while still a little unsteady, he was ready to run. "Really now, little human? After I saved you from that predator that wanted to eat you?" the Rex said. Jack shook his head, trying to shake off the dizziness still clinging to him like a parasite. "You ate me," he said. "You ate me, and this must be my personal hell." The Rex snorted, the end points of her mouth impossibly, twitching into an ever slight grin. "You're adorable." "No, what I did was caught you, and made the one chasing you think I ate you. Very different than actually doing it. If I'd swallowed you, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I just held you inside my jaws like one of your kind would hold a piece of candy. Once the one after you realized its meal was gone, it didn't stick around, and I spat you right back out." Jack's dizzy mind turned the words over and over as it processed them, and it concluded that the Rex was right. He didn't want to admit it, but she had to have been right about what happened. Though maybe it was just the heat getting to his already light head. If she was lying, then why would she spit him back out, though? It didn't make sense that she would, unless she really did want to help him. But why would she? What was her motivation to care about what happened to some random person who literally ran into her? The scenario just hurt his confused brain even more, and it didn't help the dizziness go away any faster. Not even a thank you? The Rex asked. So, what are you going to do now? Jack replied, finally able to form words and ignoring the Rex's question. He was more worried in what her next action would be rather than responding to her statement. If she was waiting to eat him for real, he knew he wouldn't be able to get away, even if he was on steady feet. So if that was her plan, he just wanted to know so he could accept it like he had before she'd saved him. The Rex cocked her head again. I have no intention of hurting you, she said, though you certainly seem to have convinced yourself otherwise. As she spoke, Jack's head finally cleared and he took a few deep breaths, pushing himself off of the tree and back a few steps. Now with his mind more cleared up, he regarded the conversation over again. So, why save me if you're not just going to eat me? Isn't that what you guys do? What's in it for you otherwise if I'm not meat on the table? Jack asked, still backing away with slow, slightly unsteady steps, not taking his eyes off the oversized dinosaur long enough to even blink. What? Just because I'm a giant carnivore, it means I can't suppress those instincts to do the right thing? Isn't that what you humans used to do? Aside from the giant part, put all the bad things aside and work together? Ones like me are not like the ones that can't talk. We've got a bit more going on in our head, like being able to make a choice to help someone in need. Sure, some of us that can talk are as evil as some bad people, but there are some, like me, that are kind, like many of you can be, the Rex said. Jack paused. You really aren't? The Rex nodded. Jack sighed, allowing himself to relax just ever so slightly. Okay, well, thank you then. You're welcome. We're not all bad, the Rex said. Now, if you would be so kind as to actually let me eat you as a way of saying thanks, that'd be great. What? Jack sputtered, stumbling back and falling on his butt again. The Rex just smiled that dinosaur smile, showing her large, pointed teeth off, and let out a bellowing chuckle. Just kidding. I just wanted to see how you'd react. After the candy comparison, I just had to, she said, chomping her jaws together and getting to her feet. So do you have somewhere to go? Anywhere that's not your stomach or your mouth. Comments like that will be the death of me, Jack muttered to himself before he said out loud, I have a camp a few miles towards the mountains from the place you found me. If you'd like me to go back there with you, just to make sure you make it. Okay, I can do that, the Rex said, nudging Jack back onto his feet with her nose. You came from that way. Jack nodded, realizing that she'd follow him even if he said otherwise, and started walking in the indicating direction. Uneasy, but still grateful for the offered protection. Though it was also still unnerving being constantly followed by a massive, oversized Tyrannosaurus Rex as well, especially when it didn't take its eyes off you once, as you literally walked in its engulfing shadow. Jack's camp was untouched when he and the Rex arrived, and he quickly went to his tent, grabbing his water flask and taking a long drink. The summer heat had nearly run him dry. As he was doing this, the Rex looked around. You're all alone? She asked. It's rare to still see people out here who aren't part of a group. The camp was in an open space, wide, but bordered by dense trees, and was virtually at the base of one of the mountains. She deduced he was alone because not only was there not a place anyone could be hiding, it was also only set up for the use of one person. Jack nodded, lowering the flask away from his mouth to speak. I have been since my twin brother snapped and decided to kill everyone in our group before taking off in the only working car we had for California. What's in California? The Rex asked, speaking the foreign word slowly to make sure she pronounced it correctly. She couldn't fathom why something in some faraway location would prompt someone to try and kill their own brother for a working vehicle. His ex-high school sweetheart, Jack replied. That's what's out there. Or so he thought. She actually moved to Baja, California, not the state. So, the world stuck that bird up his ass there. No last laugh for him. If he even made it that far. That was 6 years ago, Jack said, shaking his head a little. He then looked up at the Tyrannosaur. So, do you have a name? I feel like I need to call you something if you're going to keep hanging around, he asked, taking notice of the fact that the T-Rex seemed in no hurry to leave, even though they were at the camp. Is that an invitation to stay with you? The Rex asked. I know I did sort of invite myself back here before. But I wouldn't mind hanging around. You're kind of funny, cutie. As long as you don't eat me for real, yes? Jack replied, sounding like he was questioning his own words even as he said them. He also chose to ignore her last comment entirely, instead of being flustered by it. I mean, you don't seem to be in a hurry to leave. So, I couldn't even make you, so yeah, you can hang out as long as you want to, I suppose. He wasn't sure why he offered to agree to such an arrangement, but the words have sort of spilled out. Part of him deep down must have been more tired of being alone and constantly vulnerable than he realized, if he was willing to quickly accept such company after knowing them for such a short amount of time. The Tyrannosaurus reared back a bit, lightly snapping her jaws like she had earlier, following it up with a teasing smirk. Oh, so I can continue tossing you up so you fall into my jaws, then sucking on you again like hard candy? The Rex asked with what sounded like a human laugh. Jack just stared up at her, eyes wide and expression exasperated. Oh, okay, I won't do that either, the Rex said. Unless I feel like you owe me for something, she quickly added, getting yet another exasperated look from Jack. Again, he realized that he really must have missed company if he was willing to accept that so quickly. Damned if I do, damned if I don't. At least this one won't actually eat me, like the next will, he thought. But if teasing was the price that came with a companion, then he could accept that part of her. Hey, I'm an actual giant carnivore, not just one in ego like a lot of people tend to be. And you are a perfectly bite-sized cutie, so don't give me such a shocked look like you can't believe I'd at least suggest it. Do you have a name or not? Jack asked the Rex, wanting to change the topic away from the fact that she thought he was perfectly bite-sized and back to his original question that she'd ignored, trying to get the horrible mental vision of being stuck inside her mouth again and sucked on like candy out of his head. No, I never needed one. When I hatched, I was alone and had to raise myself, she replied, finally letting the topic drift away from causing Jack more chagrin. And I guess I never had a reason to give myself one since there was never anyone around to call me by it. Sorry, Jack replied, noticing the shift in her voice and deciding to just not think about her teases or the possible promises she might carry out later. Her teasing demeanor had gone away in that moment, and her tone was serious. It sounded lonely, like she was as tired of being alone as he was. Maybe the very reason she had just not let him go off on his own after saving his life. Maybe, deep down, deep enough that they didn't realize it, they just wanted a companion. Maybe it was why Jack didn't put up more of a fight when she'd followed him. Don't be. Many of us had to, she replied, with the same tone of voice that carried a sense of longing with it. Hatched alone. So you were one of the first ones that reappeared at the start of all this. Neat. You don't, like, by any chance remember if you existed about 68, 69 million years ago, do you? Jack asked. One of his old theories had been that the anomaly had taken animals that lived and died in the past and given them new lives in the present. No, the Tyrannosaurus replied, shaking her large head. Jack nodded. Fair enough. Is just that we never found out where the dinosaurs or any of the prehistoric creatures came from, so thought I'd ask if it was possible that you were reborn after living a past life, however millions of years ago, he said. Well, even if I did live way back during the original time of the dinosaurs, I doubt I would have had a name then either, the Rex said, with a slight chuckle this time. Again, fair enough. Jack chuckled as well. Well, you should name yourself now, he said. Be like a kind of statement that you're not just another hungry T-Rex, like all those old movies used to show, but rather your own person. Or dinosaur. Oh, I don't know. You give me one, the Rex replied. Jack paused for a moment. He muttered, leaning into his tent to look for inspiration, not having expected to be entrusted with this out of the blue. He didn't find anything for several moments, until he realized what month it was. Well, what do you think of June? June. What made you think of that? She asked. I don't know, it just seems to fit your personality, Jack said, looking up at his unexpected but now welcome new friend. He now had to admit that in truth the idea of company, even from a giant dinosaur that could eat him in one bite, was nice since said dinosaur really wanted to be friends. June, she said. I like it. And I'm happy you opened yourself up to being friends with a oh-so-scary big meat-eater like me, she added, tone both playful and grateful, as she lowered her head down to be at eye level with Jack, sniffing her new friend, and after looking at him for several seconds, giving him a giant affectionate lick on the side, which Jack did not seem to be too approving of. I think you and I will get along very well, my little human piece of candy. Jack shook his head. Oh, back to it already, he muttered. June, I trust you, but please don't do that to me. Or call me that. Ever. Just one time? June asked, giving him the Tyrannosaur version of puppy dog eyes, an odd sight on such a massive creature that no one should be able to see close up and live to tell the tale. An animal that also should not have had intelligence equal to a human, or intelligence enough to pull that look off, mixed with the blunt dinosaur instincts programmed into it. But this one did. Jack just sighed, feeling a little nauseous, and shook his head. A tiny voice was reminding him that she most certainly could do that if she really wanted to. June was certainly a personality and a presence he would have to get used to. Hopefully she was all jokes and no bite. I'll just take that as a we'll talk about it later, June said with a snort, licking her jawline as she said it. Jack just looked up at the Tyrannosaur with the same look of exasperation. Yep, she was most certainly a personality he would have to get used to, and he was okay with that. In time, he supposed he'd grow to love her sense of humor. Hopefully that was all the candy comments were. Hopefully. Probably not. Before that, though, I realized that I don't know your name yet, June said. Jack hadn't even realized that it hadn't been shared. You've got to give me something so I don't just have to call you cutie or bite-sized all the time, she added. Jack sighed. It never stops. Jack, I'm Jack, he said. June smiled down at him, stepping back so that he was no longer in her shadow. It's very nice to meet you, Jack, she said. Version 2 sat in the yard, under the light of the full moon. He'd had his fun, scaring a few of the family members in his own ways, letting them have tiny glimpses of him. He'd even staged a frightening photo on the camera he had seen the father checking shortly after he had first started stalking the family. Which was also how he had even learned what a game camera was. But he had already enjoyed himself enough. It was time for the real game to begin. If he wanted, he could have just slipped into the house and killed them all silently. But where was the fun in that? A few hours after the last light in the house was extinguished, Version 2 crept out of the forest and sat in the yard for a time before approaching the building. One of the cameras Adam had set up snapped a photo of him in full view, entering from the left of the frame and approaching the house on all fours, but Version 2 didn't care. None of them would live long enough to check the pictures. Drool dripping from his maw, he approached the house and sulked about the walls, sniffing the air. He stopped near the front porch, stood on his hind legs, and began climbing up onto the walls. He pulled himself up with several strong lunges, and soon he reached the roof. He climbed onto the top and settled on the apex, finding his balance, using his finger and toe claws as a way to anchor in place and steady himself, still sniffing the night air, waiting for the right moment to wake everyone inside the house up. And then his night of fun would begin. Maeve Wachowski was lying in her bed, unable to sleep, staring into her dark room with the blankets pulled practically all the way over her head. She wanted nothing more than to run from the house and back to Streakbart and Gamma, the ones who had believed her that there actually was something out there. The silence was broken by a sudden loud creaking, and another and another. Unusual sounds. Maeve had never heard the cabin make those sounds. And they were moving, she realized. She whimpered, pulling her blanket up tighter around herself, eyes darting around her dark bedroom. The creaking moved up the wall and onto the roof, where it stopped. Maeve stared with wide eyes up at the dark ceiling, whimpering and close to having a panic attack. She was wide awake, but so scared that she couldn't make herself scream. Outside, silhouetted against the moon, the same moon that had witnessed the rise and extinction of the dinosaurs, that watched as early humans like Homo habilis, Agaster, and Erectus walked down the early path that led to humanity, that watched as humans rose and built civilization which ultimately fell, had watched the dinosaurs return from extinction, that had witnessed as both now shared the earth, the constant factor that overlooked it all, now looked down at Version 2. shining its pale light on his black scales and armor. If there was ever a witness to ghosts, it would have been the moon, as it had witnessed every life and death that had ever come on the earth, from all the long distant ages of the past to the present moment. It watched ever silently as Version 2 steadied himself, stood up as best he was able to on the roof, and roared, an extremely loud, ear-piercing shrieking that tore through the night. The moonlight silhouetted his head and teeth, casting their shadow down onto the roof of the house. Maeve screamed, snapped out of her frozen state by the roar, and tumbled out of her bed at the sound. She heard her parents' bedroom door slam open as she sat up on the floor and worked to untangle herself from the blanket. Outside, Version 2, still perched on the roof, roared again, louder than his previous one. Adam realized from the direction that the sound was coming from that whatever was outside, it was on the roof, and he looked back into his dark bedroom. "Stay here. Load one of the other rifles," he shouted to Kalani, sprinting down the hall and passing Nolan's room as Nolan opened the door. "Dad?" Nolan asked. Adam stopped and grabbed his son by the shoulder. "Nolan, get your clothes on, stay here, and check on your sisters," he ordered, squeezing his son's shoulder before he took off through the living room. He grabbed the rifle that was left next to the window, ejected the shell in the chamber, made sure that the rifle was loaded, and ran to the front door. The roar from outside came again as Adam struggled to put his boots and vest on in the dark. As her father ran down the hallway, Maeve freed herself, hearing Nolan's door close again. Panicked, she grabbed her red jacket, slid on her boots, and ran to her window, stopping to grab a wind-up flashlight from her big desk drawer. Keeping the light off, she climbed outside and fell into the dried rose bush that was outside her window. She crept into the yard, just far enough to make sure the monster on the roof wasn't looking at her. And once she was sure it wasn't, she took off for the woods, light still off, running faster than she had ever run before. She reached the trees in no time and turned the light on, winding it up enough just so that she could make sure she wasn't going to run into anything, and then kept running. In record time, she cleared the distance to the cave shaft. Stumbling around the opening, Maeve half ran, half danced over to a tree. She dropped her flashlight, grabbed the box of matches from inside the hole, and struck one. Double-checking that his rifle had enough ammunition, Adam, dressed and prepared, crept to the door, gun already pointing forward. He took a deep breath to prepare himself and calm his racing nerves, and then he reached for the door's latch. Outside, Version 2 shifted his position, his large claws dislodging and sending a few roof tiles sliding down towards the ground. Version 2 growled, watching them fall to the ground before he reared his head back and roared again towards the starry sky. He'd stay right where he was for however long it took to draw someone from the family outside. It would be easier than breaking inside right away, which he could have easily done. But it was more fun to have them, the food, come to him instead. Maeve set the fuse to the fireworks alight, dropped the match, and began running back through the trees, leaving the flashlight because she couldn't find it. Its light must have run down and clicked off, and she knew she didn't have time to search around for it with how many fireworks were about to be shot off. The only thing Maeve could do was sprint towards home and hope that she didn't run into anything. Nolan opened Katrina's door, flashlight in his hand as well, and he spotted her sitting up on her bed, terrified. He nodded to her and left, leaving the door open, and went to Maeve's room. He opened it and found it empty, with the window wide open. Katrina watched her brother leave her room, crying from terror as he did. The thing outside on the roof roared again and Katrina screamed, covering her ears to block the sound. She had never been so scared in her entire life. It was this kind of paralyzing fear that her father had said she wasn't ready for. He had been right. She understood that now. Helping her dad on the boat had filled her with confidence, which now had all been torn away. Katrina's view of what the wider world must have been like had changed completely. It was no longer this exciting, mysterious thing that her brother always got to experience instead of her. It was just scary. The horrors that waited out there were no longer far away in a wide world, however. They had come to the Wachowski home. The world had finally thrown something back at them. Version 2's roar was cut off as a sudden bright series of rockets flew into the air in the distance and exploded above the forest. He wheeled his head around and stared over his shoulder in that direction. Several alarmed pterosaurs and various birds began flying out of the trees and away from the area, visible in the colorful flashes of light that filled the night sky as they vanished into the sky. Version 2 paid the squawking animals no mind. His attention was focused on the source of the flying reptiles' collective alarm. The quills on the back of his head rose like hackles as he glared. Adam threw the front door open and sprinted across and off the porch, carrying his rifle in both hands, as a series of fireworks suddenly shot off to his right in the distant woods. Still running, he briefly turned his head to look in that direction, but he couldn't be worried right now with whoever had set them off. He faced forward again and stopped his sprint and spun around to face what was on the roof of the house. Kalani, meanwhile, now armed herself, watched Adam sprint out of the house. Once he was off the porch, she slammed the door shut behind him and prayed that everything would be okay. As she spoke to whatever higher power she wasn't sure if she really believed in or not, begging for deliverance, she slid a bullet into the chamber of the rifle and aimed the gun at the door. She briefly had a memory flash into her mind from years prior that occurred in that exact spot. Her and Adam holding the door closed while aggressive, gigantic primates tried to force it open. She took a breath to steady herself, and it passed. And she knew that she could face it, whatever it was. Even if an entire siege of Dinopithecus were out there, she could face it down and it wouldn't get her kids. Her worst fear would not come to pass. Her worst nightmare was not going to happen. She would not let it. Streakbart and Gamma all jerked awake and leapt to their feet, seeing the show of fireworks blasting into the sky. The raptors all looked at each other for a moment, and then took off at full speed in the direction of the house. Adam's eyes widened. He couldn't believe it. It was the same dinosaur that he thought he'd killed on the beach. Apparently he hadn't been successful, and it was no longer a weak and seemingly dying creature, but one at the peak of its strength. And it appeared to be just as dangerous as he had feared it would be. The dinosaur was sitting on the roof, clinging on with the claws on its hands and feet. It was looking down at him, though, its head partially silhouetted in the moon, snarling, its glowing eyes deranged, wild, and locked, unblinking on Adam. Adam didn't wait a moment more. He raised the gun and fired at the animal. Version 2 felt the bullet strike above his shoulder, but the Dunkleosteus armor deflected the shot, causing the bullet to bounce harmlessly off and roll down the roof. Snarling, Version 2 relaxed the grip of his claws on the tiles, and he slid down the slanted surface to the end of the roof, where he jumped down onto the ground, landing on all fours. He roared, tail swinging, eyes still locked on Adam. Adam stared at the dinosaur, his own eyes wide as well. He fired again, this time at the animal's head, but there was no effect at all on the dinosaur, which had begun to slowly prowl closer. Adam fired 2 more times, and both times the shots bounced off Version 2's skull, and he continued to prowl closer, snarling all the while. Adam just stared, unable to believe that the bullets were doing no good. He fired yet another shot at the dinosaur's head, aimed right between its eyes, but that bullet too just bounced harmlessly off the armor covering the thing's head without leaving so much as a scratch. For a brief moment, though it seemed to go on forever, the two stared into each other's eyes. Version 2 growled softly, enjoying the satisfaction he was feeling at finally reaching this moment. "What the fuck are you?" Adam eventually asked. Still snarling, Version 2 stopped moving and snorted in a manner which resembled a chuckle. "The monster your daughter saw at her bedroom window. And I've come for all of you." For a moment, moment, it was like there was a respite, as Adam took in what the thing had said. Version 2 then charged, springing forward on all fours with great speed, and Adam turned and ran into the nearest line of trees, fleeing into the forest. The fireworks were long over now, and whatever flashing, dancing, yet illuminating and helpful light they might have given off was over as well, and the forest was plunged into a black void. Panicked, Adam stumbled and fumbled his way through the trees, the mad-sounding roars of the dinosaur getting closer and closer no matter how quickly he ran. In the dark, he tripped over a large root and his rifle went flying from his grasp. It vanished in the woods somewhere off to his side, but Adam couldn't waste time trying to find it. He got to his feet and kept running. Version 2 following, just a few seconds behind him.